I was going to say, thank everybody for being here, but it's impossible to tell who's been here and who's not been here. So those of you who have been here the whole time, you're saintly, and thank you all. And I'm going to try. I actually feel kind of bad because when Chris first asked me to do this, my first thought was to give a paper, which I thought then decided not to do because I thought it wouldn't be relevant for this audience. It was a paper called Anti-Capitalism and the Camera. It's about art and capitalism. I thought no one would care. Now I realize that that was by far, if I could have just rewritten the last paragraph, I could have turned it into a kind of rousing defense of the PMC and made it completely relevant to our discussions and kept people interested. But I didn't. I decided to do something else more about class, and I'm afraid it's going to be much more boring than my defense of the PMC would have been. I will say the one thing about the debate going on before, which I really enjoyed and think is useful, but I do think it's worth sort of thinking that you are standing outside capitalism and thinking that you have made a work of art that is in some sense critical of capitalism are not even close to being the same thing. And any more than, say, a professor who writes a book criticizing the PMC is doing, as it were, exactly the same thing as a professor in the same institution at the same rank who writes a book praising the PMC. One hasn't, as it were, exhausted one's sense of the book by noting that it was produced to be sold and also so one could be promoted. So I think there is the question the work of art is always going to raise, and even one's books on the PMC are going to raise, are what is one's relation to that position? And works of art will differ in how they deal with that. But I do think it isn't, the fact that it's produced by the PMC is not in itself either dispositive or in the end, actually all that explanatory. And that would have been part of the argument that I would have made if I'd given, the interesting talk. So instead, we're going to go with the boring talk. But I will say about this, instead of a rousing defense of the PMC, what I'm going to give instead is what turns into a rousing defense of class reductionism. So, basically, as I say the thing, I've been called a class reductionist for, I think the first time I ever heard the word was someone calling me that. And many people with whom I'm associated, some of them are probably in this extended room, have also been called it. And I just thought, as I'll explain in the paper, well, I'm tired of apologizing or saying that's not really it, or even there's no such thing, but I'm going to sort of go with it. So yeah, this is a paper. Chris has sort of proposed to be interested in the university. I was a little bit interested in that myself, but I thought, so a reasonable question, about a talk on the university and the American class system is, why even bother? What else, whatever else you might think of him, didn't Althusser get this exactly right when outlining many, many years ago the role played by what he called the repressive state apparatus, the police, in reproducing the class structure of capitalist society? He went on to insist on the importance also of what he called the ideological state apparatus, that's us, the school, in reproducing, quote, the ability to manipulate the ruling ideology correctly for the agents of exploitation and repression. His basic idea was what the police did by force, by violence, the school did by ideology. But of course, it's true, at the time Althusser produced that analysis, the events of May 68 had already introduced what he called a crisis of the educational system in every capitalist country. And a fundamental expression of that crisis was that it pitted the students supposedly learning how to manipulate the ruling ideology correctly against the police, supposedly enforcing the same ideology by violence. And that opposition, students against the police, has been a staple of modern politics. Today, for example, the call to defund the repressive state apparatus characteristically comes from the ideological state apparatus. So does this mean that today the university is resisting its ideological role? So no, not really, but it is fulfilling it in a slightly more complicated way. Not so much by denouncing police violence as by denouncing it as racist and by locating its harm in the racism. The police killed 107 unarmed people in the US in 2020. A disproportionate number of them were Black, and there's little doubt that racism plays a role in that disproportion. But the largest number of unarmed people killed by the police were white. Why is this worth pointing out? Not because we should be as angry about the white people killed by the police, although of course we should, but because it helps us understand the ideological function of the focus on Black lives, which is to locate the fundamental injustice of police violence in its racist application, rather than in the violence itself. Perhaps we can make the point a little sharper by noting that the targets of police violence are disproportionately Black people, but are of course overwhelmingly poor people. We don't have very good data on the economic status of people killed by the police, but we do on people who are incarcerated. Their median annual incomes are less than half the incomes of people who don't get sent to prison, which surprises no one because we all understand that disproportionately harassing, arresting, and even sometimes killing poor people is and has always been a crucial part of the police's job. Indeed, in 19th century Chicago, their responsibility for what was characteristically called maintaining public order tended to be especially focused on workers. Just between 1875 and 1900, the Chicago police jailed nearly 1 million workers for what are described by the historian who writes about this, trivial public order offenses. Today, labor militants is largely out of the picture, but the job of maintaining public order, especially in a society which may be even more unequal now than it was then, is at least as demanding. Indeed, when we of the ISA accuse the RSA of disproportionate violence against Black people instead of disproportionate violence against poor people, it's because we understand very well that maintaining order among and against the poor is what we pay them for. And especially that in making sure poor people don't take things away from rich people, if we were all actually in Chicago and on the beautifully manicured campus of the University of Chicago, I would ask you just to look around. They are protecting us. This is the conservative function of racialization. It takes a system that exists to enforce the oppression of the working class and redescribes it as enforcing racial oppression, thus turning the socialist goal of getting rid of the class structure into the liberal goal of making it fairer. Again, my point here is not that racism doesn't play a role in the disproportionate killing of unarmed Black people. It's rather that identifying the disproportion, and hence the racism as the problem, makes it into one that liberalism wants to solve. No more racist police. And if the more radical demand, just plain no more police, is in the current context unwise, privatized security forces producing what hedge fund managers think of as public order would not be an upgrade. What nonetheless makes it genuinely radical is that it refuses the liberal analysis of equality, which is no doubt why the university's critique of itself is the same as its critique of the police. When elite universities turn to our own problems, the ambition is to make ourselves less racist rather than to make ourselves less elite. So on the one hand, the goal, as we all know, is racial diversity. I change, every time I do a version of this, I just change the university. It was Princeton's term. Princeton, for example, is 39% white, 29% Asian, 10% Black, and 12% Hispanic. Not perfect, but close enough for jazz. While on the same hand, the goal was to reproduce the ruling class. So 44% of Princeton students come from the top 5% of American wealth. Most of the rest come from the top 20%. The successful neoliberal university will enroll Black people proportionately. The successful neoliberal police force will not kill Black people disproportionately. Conversely, just as violence against the working class is the business of the police, exclusion of the working class is the business model of the university. The police force is paid to control them. The university is paid to separate its students from them. More broadly, if we think about the difference between a critique of capitalism that demands equality, i.e. socialism, and a critique of capitalism that demands racial equality, which is the rearranging of the racial identities of its winners and losers, we begin to see that the emphasis on racial disparities, the disproportionality of the harm, rather than the harm itself, that is how the university, to quote Althusser for the last time, manipulates the ruling ideology correctly. More pointedly, we begin to see it as the dissent from the ruling ideology that gets called class reduction. It would be interesting to have a history of this term, which I believe is mainly, maybe only, been used as an accusation. In any event, it's something that some of us are often accused of, and what you usually do with an accusation is deny it. But looking at the politics of the people making the accusation, inspired by my memory of a passage from James Baldwin's Another Country, which I read as a kid when it first came out, today I want instead to accept it. In Another Country, when the relations between Leroy and Eric, so these are two young boys who have become lovers in a small town. I haven't read the book in like I confess 50 years, more than that, actually. It's more like 60 years. Well, it's almost exactly 60 years, but I got this part right. I looked it up. When the relations between Leroy and Eric reach a point where what people are saying about them can get them, Leroy says, into a lot of trouble. Eric responds, how I see it is, if we've got the name, we might as well have the game. So for today, since I've got the name, I'm inviting you to play the game. This invitation is made in the context of a half century of rising economic inequality in the US. In 1968, it was lower than it's ever been since. In 2018, it was higher than it's ever been. And just as a commitment to the importance of education has increased alongside economic inequality, since education provides the meritocratic fantasy invoked to legitimize that inequality, so the commitments to diversity and affirmative action, which is to say, the description of the American population in terms of identities rather than classes. Indeed, it's precisely because identities follow a logic that's different from that of classes, that as class stratification intensifies, race and sex have become important not only as an alternative to class, but even as a way of redescribing it. So that, for example, economic diversity might be called on to supplement racial and sexual diversity. And as the French sociologist Didier Eribon has written, the mechanisms of social domination, that is, class domination, might be made objects of critique in the same way that the mechanisms of racial and sexual domination have been. Thus, Eribon, a gay man born into a working class family, describes his book Return to Rêves as an effort to extend to poverty the kind of analysis that he himself had produced of sexuality in his earlier book, Insult and the Making of the Gay Self. As he puts it, to take social domination as seriously as he had previously taken sexual domination, even though, he says, he found it easier to write about sexual shame than class shame. What Eribon means is that he was even more ashamed of his social identity than his sexual one. But the problem runs deeper than that. For one thing, the story of his sexual identity is the story of his coming to embrace who he is, whereas the story of his social identity involves his ceasing to be who he was. The successful intellectual who no longer thinks of poverty as shameful is also a person who has stopped being poor. And for another, the fact that his poverty no longer seems to him shameful does not make it seem desirable. Getting over your shame at being gay means being perfectly happy to be gay. Getting over your shame at being poor does not mean being perfectly happy to be poor. The reason for this, of course, is that the supposed inferiority of people of color, of women, of gays is only supposed, a function of the shame-inducing disciplinary technologies to which they are subjected. Remove those technologies or even just recognize them as the legitimate constructs of a false normativity, and you begin to remove the inferiority. Remove the things that cause the shame, you remove the shame. But remove the shame experienced by Eribon's mother, forced, as he describes it, to work 2 backbreaking jobs and left even then with almost nothing, and you haven't in the slightest relieved the oppression that is built into her class position. That oppression is prior to and independent of her feelings about it. Eribon asks why certain segments of the population, gays, lesbians, transsexuals, or Jews, blacks, etc., are required to carry the social and what he calls the cultural burden of domination. But no one asks why capital needs to dominate labor. It's because capital needs to exploit labor. And that function, that structural subordination, would be in place even if poor people loved it, which of course, however, there has never been much evidence that they do. This is why Eric Olin Wright writes that the conflict between classes is understood as, quote, generated by inherent properties rather than simply contingent factors. Why Nikos Poulantzas says that even when, for tactical reasons, more nuanced accounts of class difference, bourgeois, proletarian, petty bourgeois, poor peasant, Poulantzas was too soon to fully appreciate that he should have added the PMC, are useful. The crucial thing, he says, is that all classes have existence only in the class struggle. My point in citing Wright and Poulantzas here is obviously not to sign on to either of their quite, in fact, different taxonomies of class. It's just to insist on the distinction between inherent and contingent opposition, to essentialize what Poulantzas calls struggle. Indeed, the whole point of class reduction is to insist on this essential conflict. And the reason to do it now is just because successfully manipulating the ruling ideology consists of nothing other than denying it, rewriting the fundamental conflicts as those that get called systemic precisely because they're not essential. as conflicts between identities rather than classes. Every time you hear someone say that America's original sin is racism, you are not only hearing a misleading version of history, you are also hearing a kind of ruling class lullaby. Racism is a sin we can atone for. You've heard a lot about the efforts to atone for it today. Even better, it's a sin we can blame on the white working class. You've heard a lot about that today too. And best of all, this is the point of calling class conflict essential, where the conflict between classes can only end when the ruling class has been destroyed. And indeed, when class itself has been destroyed, the conflict between races can end when the ruling class has been made as diverse as the student bodies of the universities its children attend. That's why affirmative action, a minor factor even in university life, plays such a prominent role in political life. Just as Black Lives Matter embodies what Cedric Johnson calls militant liberalism, and I would say this actually goes back to the kind of great presentation of the Chicago girls earlier today, which I loved, but you'd want to say that imagine oneself agnostic as to all the questions, points made by and questions raised against value theory and their use of it. I think it's almost uncontroversially true that what gets called identity politics, which I'll be talking about in a minute, completely presents itself as a liberal intervention of the question. It doesn't call itself liberal, thinks of itself as radical, but it completely understands itself and presents itself as involved with the essentially liberal question of discrimination, racism, et cetera, all the way down. So the actual surface is precisely at that level. So this is what Johnson, Cedric calls militant liberalism. Affirmative action embodies the liberal math that identifies justice with proportionate representation, and therefore requires class to be either ignored or, as when we imagine supplementing racial diversity with economic diversity, redescribed as an identity, as if admitting more poor students were like admitting more Black students. The disanalogies are obvious. Black students don't come to university to learn to stop being Black. Poor students for sure do. If you admitted poor students on the proportionate model, most of the students you currently have would be kicked out. Why then does the idea of economic diversity retain its appeal? Because it describes the injustice as a consequence of discrimination, treatable by anti-discrimination. Liberalism's commitment to equality is thus wedded to a particular causal account of inequality. If you're poor because you or your ancestors were discriminated against, you are entitled to redress. If not, not. So if you or your family were denied access to the housing market by redlining, you're entitled to reparations. But not if you couldn't come up with a mortgage because, say, your grandparents' union was busted. Why? We already know the answer. Anti-discrimination makes no objection to inequality as such, only to those inequalities that are a function of racism, the heritage of slavery, etc. In other words, anti-racism is the perfect egalitarianism for a society that's becoming increasingly unequal and is more interested in legitimating that inequality than in eliminating it, which is why compensation for redlining has already become a thing, but there's no compensation and never ever will be for your grandparents' union being busted. But my real point here is not that we should expand the relevant narratives of injustice by making room for the descendants of the formerly unionized. It's that we should deny the relevance of any causal account. If you think that housing is a public good and should be decommodified, it no longer matters whether or why your grandparents couldn't get a mortgage. You're entitled to housing no matter what happened to them and no matter what they did. That's the difference between trying to make the housing market fairer and trying to eliminate it. Socialism renders the causal account of how you came to be in need, and therefore the individualizing determination of whether your particular causal account is the right one, irrelevant. More generally, the universalizing ambition to make everyone equal makes the history of how we became unequal irrelevant. From this standpoint, although many argue that, as Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor has put it, the struggle for radical change in the US is hindered by the failure of our society to grapple with the history of slavery, that the question of social justice more generally is a function of our refusal to grapple with our history more generally, the truth seems to me exactly the opposite. To be a class reductionist is also to be a history abolitionist. It's not the historic wrongs done to the working class that are the grounds of workers' demands today. It's a commitment to the public good, not a commitment to making reparative compensation to those who've been unfairly hindered from successfully pursuing their own private good. In this respect, the current enthusiasm for putting racism at the center of both US and capitalist history, think the 1619 Project, or more seriously, the renewed interest in Cedric Robinson's redescription of capitalism as racial capitalism, is an expression of enthusiasm for liberalism's idea of equality. And this is not just because the 1619 Project is misleading, or even because what it's misleading about is precisely the primacy of racism in American history. It's because of its commitment to the idea that justice consists in undoing the damage of the past. Making history the key to social justice is like replacing socialism with an unusually progressive and particularly ambitious program of tort reform. When Marx said the philosophers have only interpreted the world, that the point was to change it, he should have added that historians have only understood the past, the point is to forget it. But of course, the author of From Each According to His Ability to Each According to His Needs could not have anticipated the degree to which to each according to his ability to establish a right of restitution with respect to property stolen from his ancestors would become a battle cry of the left. With the claims made for racial capitalism, however, the situation is a bit different, since whether or not it's always been true that, as Cedric Robinson wrote in Black Marxism, race has been the ordering principle and organizing structure of capital, there's a sense in which it certainly is true today. Only if you can take a society organized around the relations between classes and redescribe it as organized around the relations between races can you make programs like affirmative action and the whole apparatus of racially proportionate redistribution look like a left politics. Which is just to say that anti-racism can be, and I think today is, just as useful to capitalism as racism has been. The one plays a role in producing the actual distribution of white and Black people across classes. The other provides a model for their ideal distribution across classes. And here too, the university plays a central role. It's not just that we fail to live up to our egalitarian ideals by mainly admitting rich kids. It's not just that we then devote ourselves to teaching the rich kids to misunderstand the system that has made them rich, i.e. by telling them it was systemic racism. And it's not even that we teach them that the way to improve the situation is by coming to terms with our history. It's that even if we admitted everyone and told them the truth about how capitalism works and explained to them that history doesn't matter, our main purpose would still be to function as a sorting system for an economy that condemns more and more people to worse and worse jobs. Right now, the fastest growing job in the US is healthcare aid. And that's been true actually ever since I started looking at the Bureau of Labor Statistics like 10, 12 years ago. Healthcare aides require only a high school education and are very badly paid, about $27,000 a year. About 10 or 11 years ago, they were paid about $22,000 a year. More generally, the lifetime earnings of high school graduates are 62% of the earnings of college graduates. Indeed, the whole point of the college degree is the relative advantage it offers. What Chicago State offers over high school, what UIC, my university, offers over Chicago State, what the University of Chicago offers over UIC. We're all selling competitive advantage, and it's worth buying. Today, whether you have a college degree is a better predictor of how long you live than, for example, your race. So would going to college benefit health aides? In one sense, of course, yeah. Home health aides, the worst paid, are disproportionately Black and brown. If more Black and brown women went to college, fewer of them would end up being health aides. But somebody would. Indeed, even if everybody went to college, 4.6 million college graduates, if the BLS is right, would still be healthcare aides and would still be making $27,000 a year. The militant liberalism of Black Lives Matter focuses on the question of what race these workers should belong to. A militant liberal feminism would focus also on their sex. A truly intersectional liberalism would focus in addition on what class they came from. Class reduction doesn't care. Doesn't care what color they are, what sex they belong to, or how rich or poor their parents are. Class reduction is completely indifferent to them as individuals. and indeed to the individualism that is irreducibly at the heart of all the liberal race, gender, and class narratives of restored property. From the standpoint of class reduction, what's called identity politics is not, as the right endlessly complains, an attack on the dignity of the individual, but an intensified commitment to it. It makes everything about you count, insofar as everything about you is a potential site of discrimination, of the absence of or access to privilege. By contrast, the anti-identitarianism and anti-historicism of class reduction are also anti-individualist. Class reduction cares more about your job than it cares about you. Its idea of social change is not changing the rules that make it possible for some people to avoid bad jobs, but making the bad jobs into good ones. More radically, of course, it cares about destroying the structure of wage labor itself. But as Marx himself insisted, just after the much quoted bit in the Critique of the Gotha program, where he points out the ultimate incoherence of the effort toward equality, and right mixed in there with redistribution, also not good. But as Marx himself points out, pointing out the incoherence, right? He says the contradictions produced by that effort are, quote, inevitable, even in the first phase, he doesn't say even, inevitable in the first phase of communist society. Why? Because in the first phase, dictatorship of the proletariat, different social classes still exist, and quote, since right can never be higher than the economic structure of society, close quote, so do the contradictions of the class structure. They haven't gone away. So for us, we are obviously not yet burdened by the difficulties inherent in the dictatorship of the proletariat. That's like a long ways away. But for us, anything that transfers wealth to workers, that transfers power to workers, that pushes toward decommodifying healthcare, housing, and education is at least a step toward changing that economic structure. And nothing that doesn't do any of those things is. And of course, nothing in that structure, as it's constituted today, is in any way threatened by making the structure less, by making it less anti-Black, although it certainly is anti-Black, or less misogynistic. Indeed, the enthusiasm today for the idea of structural racism seems to me entirely a reflection of the degree to which racism today isn't needed to maintain the economic structure, and of the way in which anti-racism can only be counted on not to weaken it, but is deployed every day to strengthen it. Which doesn't mean, of course, that we shouldn't try to make the structure less anti-Black and less misogynistic. Which brings us to the point where I usually deny that I'm a class reductionist, since I too am committed to anti-racism. But, and this will be just to sum up the point of accepting the accusation instead of now denying it, the differences between class reduction and its accusers have nothing to do with their comparative enthusiasm for anti-racism. They are instead analytic, consisting in the argument that if the effort to make the economic structure less racist isn't subsumed by the effort to change the structure, it functions instead as part of the effort to preserve it. And that argument is historical, by which I mean that it's not meant as a contribution to the race-class debate. It's meant instead as an account of how capitalism is working now, when race, properly understood, is nothing more than an effect of racism, and when the complete inadequacy of the parallel formation, class is an effect of classism, suggests how misconceived the debate is. But that's a slightly different story, and I definitely, hoping today for discussion, wanted to leave some time for discussion about literature and art, no doubt, as well as about class reduction. So I'll stop here.
Thank you, Walter. I'm going to open up Q&A in actually a bit of a more flexible format. Attendees are going to be allowed to raise their hands, and we'll call on them, and they can join audio and video if they like. So Brian Leiter has raised his hand.
Is there any way I can see the attendings?
Yeah, sure. Brian, would you like to have your video shared?
That's fine.
Walter, we can't show you everyone, but we can show you who you're talking to.
Well, I see Brian's name, but I don't see him.
There we go. Am I visible and audible?
You're visible and audible.
Well, thank you. That was a great talk. I hope you'll email it to me. I'd love to have a copy.
I'm already, I guess this is being recorded, otherwise I'm just denying I made it.
All right. I mean, I'm certainly very simpatico to most of the things you said, but I want to ask you a question about the police. You said the police, their business is violence against the working class. The police are also part of the working class. They may have been co-opted in the interests of capitalism. And as you pointed out, of course, police violence primarily has a class dimension to it rather than a racial dimension to it. So what are we to do with that as a practical matter? Right? The police are part of the working class. No socialist transformation will be successful without the support of the people with the guns. The people with the guns are pretty important in the event that you get mugged outside UIC or I get mugged here in Hyde Park. So I wonder whether it really does justice to the role the police play to say their business is the violence against the working class.
Yeah, no, that's fair. I mean, it's a shorthand question because also I did say too, right, that, I mean, their business, it's an important thing, right? And for those of us who've been in Chicago, and I'm sure it's true elsewhere, you know, lots of times, especially last summer, when you had lots of demonstrations, right, defund the police or at least de-racify the police, you also had people, you still even here in Little Village after this last event, in the neighborhood saying, actually, we don't want the police to go away because although they've got problems, right, and they've got problems with the police, they also don't want to be left, as a word of their own devices, unpoliced. So there's no question, but it's complicated. Whether the police belong to the working class or to the PMC, I don't know what you may have missed in Area 1, but there was a kind of very provocative, but in a way, made kind of convincing suggestion that structurally they belong to the PMC. But yeah, I mean, I take the point. And I don't, I mean, a true discussion of this would require actually, you know, looking at it very differently, and I mean, more complicatedly, and also thinking about what it meant that they become like, you know, that teachers union on one side and the police unions on the other are now the standard bearers for unions with very different ideological commitments, but both of them also public worker unions, which is a mark of a problem in the union movement, you know, more generally. So yeah, I don't really have a lot at stake in what class they actually belong to. My point was just this, that there is no description, whatever their own class base is, there's no description of them, which doesn't, just in terms of common sense, but also in terms of the data say, primarily the people whom the police are poor people, the working class, and the people whom they defend are everybody else. And that the important thing to see right about that is that that's just true of the university too, true in a different way of the university. So that this sort of internecine war, this would make it be internecine. The war between the police and the university, which looks like it is the kind of, you know, cutting edge of where we are about police abolition, let the police do what they want, that war is a completely internecine war. And in fact, it produces the same result, it produces the same vision of what's going on in the world. So I don't know if that's an answer to the question, but it's like, I just take the point of the question, which is that, yeah, we don't want to simplify this, but I don't think the question of what class they belong to in the end matters all that much. It's the question of what they do that matters. And that goes back, I just want to say, to the PMC part as well. You know, we all belong to the PMC, but some of us are socialists, and therefore we have a kind of conflicted, problematic relation to belong to the PMC. And some of us, not here, but some of us are like, you know, card-carrying left neoliberals, and they fucking love belonging to the PMC. It does not exhaust, right, a description of either of us to say we belong to the PMC.
That's fair enough. I mean, I'm certainly not worried about the question which class they belong to. I'm worried about the very, in a way, the practical political question.
Yeah.
I do think that the whole defund the police thing has been a complete distraction. And the police unions, and they are working class people, even if they're, I don't think they're in the PMC, but the working class people has driven them towards the Republicans in ways that are very, very dangerous.
But we know, right, that when we're asking an English professor what the practical thing to do is. We know we're totally, completely fucked. So it probably is.
I agree, but there should be a little bit of connection between theory and praxis.
But I thought a lot of what Dino said this morning, Dino Costello said this morning, points us in the right direction. So I don't know if Dino, you can't see who's out there. If Dino's out there, he can see what he thinks about the police. But if there are other questions.
We have a question from Sarah Covington. Sarah, would you like your video shared as well?
Well, actually, my camera doesn't work, so I know that seems like an excuse, but that's true.
No problem.
But yeah, I wrote this very long sort of question. I just sort of wanted your view on the nature of public universities today and community colleges, because we talk a lot about, you know, the issue with private universities, but it's as I say in my comment, it's very, very sad to see what's happened to CUNY, where I teach. I'm at Queens College, and that's a college, that a university that's devoted itself to the working class and has working class students. But there's a strange sort of disparity now, including between faculty and students. Many of the faculty having come from private universities and very proud members of the PMC. So I just wonder how you would fit in working class or ostensibly working class institutions like CUNY, and how this fits in, because I guess I feel, and I've love your work and I love this conference, but it seems like a lot of it's directed to elite universities.
Yeah, so that's really a fair question. So first of all, I do get a little of totally unearned mileage out of teaching at UIC, just because, like, compared to the University of Chicago, we do look like a completely egalitarian institution. But of course, we're not. I mean, there's no sense at all. We're talking about the university system. And you know, when you talk about, I actually went to City College for a year and a half.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
And I kind of fond memories of the place, but even then, it was not what my grandfather told me it was when he went there. And when he went there back in the 20s, it probably wasn't that then either.
Yeah.
The main point would be, it's kind of like the problem of I mean, I think the ideal type is the best way to do it. Education cannot make a difference here. I mean, it can make a difference in what we teach, so it's better to stop misinforming everybody. But education cannot make the difference. I mean, the ideal form is just to say, look, if everybody place was as good as, pick whatever university you think is a good university. Every place was as good as that good university in precisely the way we all want it to be. And every kid got a chance to go to college. It is still the case that the jobs that are being created in our economy, the largest ones at the top of the BLS's list are health aides. The second one, equally large, is basically servers, staff, including and restaurant workers, including fast food restaurants. Also equally badly paid. Actually, right now, worse paid than that. So everybody's got a college degree. Everybody was actually taught the truth about capitalism, et cetera, like I say in the paper. But in fact, they're still going to school. They come out of school. You know, maybe they come there, maybe they're English majors and they come out. So I wrote this a long time ago, and they just did poetry, and they've read a whole lot of Walt Whitman. And I think that being able to recite a lot of Walt Whitman to yourself when you were working, like at the nursing home downtown here that my mother-in-law is in, would be, you know, kind of consoling to you, but you're still making like $24,000 a year. You're still completely underpaid. You still have to take a second job. You're doing work that is in every respect harder, maybe not harder to qualify for, but harder than the work we're doing and paid nothing. So the difference would be is that now you can talk Whitman. I don't think that's valueless. I think education becomes super valuable the moment it gets disarticulated from where you're going to end up in the workforce. So, you know, my fantasy, I don't know if Ken Warren's here, but Ken and Adolf and I have always had this fantasy of like retiring, which no one can afford to do anyway. And of then, like, and Ken's not ready, he's so young, and just starting the Free University of Chicago, like we're going to our house, 1 week down there, 1 week up here. And anybody come in, you can leave. We just set a topic, you can do what you want to do. Education itself is super valuable, but our system of education is fucked all the way down. But again, I mean, look, that's just it's a cliche. I mean, cliche, it's a truism. Anybody who works in, you know, capitalism is doing something that's wrong. So it's not really useful, as it were pointed out, but it is useful to make the point that while education is so frequently looked to as the salvation, and that is much bigger UIC thing than Asia for Chicago, we're the worst version of that. UIC's self-description is precisely, we take these kids who are underprepared, who are actually, we're majority minority a long time ago, and we take these kids and we educate them. And what do we educate them for? We educate them to, this is not the way we put it, but this is the truth of it. We educate them so that they can get the jobs that the kids who only went to Chicago State couldn't get. So obviously there's no social justice in that. So yeah, I think the public universities are every bit as bad as the private ones.
It's all credentialism, though. It's just credentialism of different degree. And it's sad because I feel like CUNY really had an opportunity to sort of lead the way to a different kind of model. But the administrators and faculty want CUNY to be NYU, and that's not what CUNY is or should be.
Right. So, but the whole thing about UIC is no, we don't want to be University of Chicago. I mean, I've said that a million times myself, and Lord knows it's true. But the sad thing about UIC is we're just a kind of like version of.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Sarah.
We have a question from Maya. Let's see.
Is Maya coming on or
yeah, Maya, would you like your video shared as well?
Sure, that's fine. Thanks.
Great.
Maya, did you want to ask it or do you want? Someone's got to read it if you're not going to ask it. There you are.
Hi, my question just disappeared from my view, but I'll read it. Thank you, first of all, for the talk. I'm quite sympathetic to your view, but I do wonder about some things. How can domestic violence against women be theorized from a class reductionist perspective? If the police discipline the poor for the sake of maintaining class status, do men discipline women for the sake of maintaining class status within the home? And if not, how else can we think of it? What is the class function of that?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, I thought something that Cedric Michael Simmons said this morning was really useful. He was asked a kind of question. He said, well, if someone says like, I think the first thing is, I don't think we need to theorize the problem of domestic violence against women. What we need to do is actually to abolish domestic violence against women. And I don't think we need to make it a kind of allegory, as your question does, or not exactly an allegory, but a kind of like give it meaning by imagining the family internally as a class structure, and then as a kind of representation of a larger class structure. For sure, you know, men discipline women for the sake of maintaining power. For sure, men discipline women for the sake of, you know, in response to whatever brutalities they've undergone in the workforce. And I'm not at all an expert on this. There are no doubt a million reasons men have to do it. But what we want to think about, and this would be a question actually, I don't know if the Chicago girls are still around, because they might have a different view on this or a better view on this, because I'm kind of open to thinking about this. But this would be a question where we want to say, yeah, this is something that's wrong. It's wrong in any society. It's not obviously the case that it would disappear in a socialist society. And it would be wrong in the socialist society too. So I don't think we need to I don't think we need to think of it as a version of, I don't think we need to think that class reduction has something to tell us, you know, that helps us understand every phenomenon here. I think what, you know, common human decency has to tell us is that this is wrong and it should be abolished. But class reduction is not going to tell us what's not doing that any more than class reduction is going to tell us like people shouldn't steal from each other, or people shouldn't beat each other up on the streets. So to me, I'd like to keep it more minimal and say, I don't think, you know, I think that the question of violence against women and the maintenance of the family in capitalism is real. I do think it would make a big difference to violence against women in the home if you did get rid of capitalism, if we were successful. But I don't think we even need the ambition to get rid of capitalism to see that that violence against women, domestic violence, is wrong. So it's kind of, I don't know if it's a helpful answer, but.
Sure, thank you. I mean, I raised it because of your comments at the opening of your talk, because of how you described the role of police in maintaining capitalism, and presumably the role of police there was to maintain some differences in class status.
But part of the thing would be there is that, you know, I mean, it's a famous thing, right? Police always say that the most dangerous calls for them, I don't know if this is true or not, but this is part of the self-representation, are domestic violence calls. So what are the police doing then? It's not as if the police aren't actually, sometimes more effectively than others, obviously, aren't actually trying to, as it were, adjudicate between members of the working class right there in the home. So in theory, right, where the cops show up and they're doing their job, what they will show up and do is rescue the woman, if it's a woman in this case, from being beaten by the man. So that's not maintaining male violence in itself, but part of the job, right? But again, it's, when I was writing Untitled with Diversity a long time ago, if I remember this right, I got interested in the question of domestic violence because there used to be so many ads on TV. I don't know if anybody will remember this. And they were trying to destigmatize it. And they were trying to destigmatize it by making the point that domestic violence was new no class. That rich people were rich women were just as likely to be the victims of domestic violence as poor women were. And as a consequence of that, and the belief in that, in fact, they were building lots and lots of new centers for women to flee to if they were running the risk of being running the risk of that violence. And they were building them equally, at least equally, in rich neighborhoods as in poor neighborhoods. But actually it wasn't, of course, true. It was actually true that no, that working class women were more likely to be the victims of domestic violence. And that makes complete sense, right? So there's a way in which, yeah, it's got a class, it's not untouched by class, but it's also not determined by class the same way. What's wrong with it is not the wrong of class oppression. What's wrong with it is a wrong that is, as it were, disarticulable from class oppression.
Thank you.
So I've got two up here. I've got Catherine, but hers is not a question here, but I'm a little bit disappointed she isn't saying anything about like how art's fucked by the PMC.
Catherine, do you want to come on board and say something like that?
Then we got Ella Heron too. She's got something up there, but she seems like a practical question, which I can't answer. So I'd rather talk about literature.
Catherine,
can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Okay, I'm going to start my video too. I just wanted to say that, I got my graduate degree at CUNY. I went to Yale as an undergraduate. And one of the things I did really believe in was, public universities. But I think, as Walter said, education is not the way out. It's not salvific anymore, if it ever was. But I just wanted to point out that, and this really is troubling in terms of politics, is that we've never had more high school graduates. We've never had more college graduates, actually, in American society. And yet, the state of our politics and our inability to actually interpret science just within the COVID pandemic is really distressing. But one of the things that I'm not sure I agree with Daniel Bernfin about, we can go back to this, is whether or not the cops are actually PMC or blue collar, because I think their credentialing system does not go through the university. And I've heard critiques, and I'm wondering what Walter thinks about this, about defunding the police as a way of making it more of a white collar profession, sort of taking away sort of the blue collar sovereignty of, whatever fucked up thing they're doing, rather than reforming that, just reducing the blue collar jobs and bringing in social workers, and the question of domestic violence up here obtains, so that you have this kind of white collarization of this entire function. And I guess Brian mentioned this earlier, because whenever I hear defund the police, I hear de-Bothification. And I see like 700,000, 800 to 800,000 people suddenly without jobs, but with very good arms training, unemployed.
Also, they won't be without jobs long, because the Pinkertons will be, immediately like in demand. And these guys have been pre-trained to be Pinkertons. So yeah, I agree with all that. But the one thing I would say, maybe this just goes back to the discussion as a whole. I think there's a difference between the force of the question, what class does someone belong to, and the force of the question, what class does that person's interests, actions, the interest of what class does that person's actions serve? So, whatever class the police belong to, and I was just sort of taken by, I like provocation. So I was taken by the provocation of Daniel's thing before. But whatever class they belong to, it's very clear what class they serve. So there's a way in which, and that's true for us as well in a different way. I mean, a different sort of set of technologies. So, to me, the issue is not in the end, like, that's actually why I was, reacting against the question of like being inside or outside capitalism. Everybody's inside capitalism. But the fact that everybody's inside capitalism does not mean that everybody acts in the same way to reproduce capitalism or alter it in various forms, or that there aren't possibilities of doing things which are, reformist in a certain way. But I actually think a big discussion should begin to take place again about the sort of revolutionary reform thing. And this would go back to people who want to say, yeah, we can't be worried just about redistribution. We can't be worried just about equality. We have to worry about, after all, the things that socialism does promise us. Yeah, those are things, A, we don't exactly know what they are, and B, we have the faintest fucking idea how to get them. And when people started saying, yeah, but we have to worry about that, that does seem to me like someone who's not quite getting the point of, the 11th thesis, which is that, and this goes back to a question someone raised, maybe it was Daniel again, about what one meant by theory. It seems to me that, one of the advantages of class reductionism, I mean, now after an hour, I'm acting like it's a thing. We can have buttons and we can all join in. But I just want to say, you won't have any more friends. You better really like the 9 people who will also wear the buttons, because they'll be the only people you're ever going to talk to the rest of your lives. But if one of the advantages of class reductionism would be precisely that it cannot help but understand itself as, in a way, moderate, doing the kinds of things that Dina was talking about this morning, but as those moderate things are, in fact, in some real sense, radical. They are things that actually work against capital. If the world were completely unionized, capitalism, as we know it, would come to an end. Starting any individual union, Jennifer and I were super active in the union that got started at UIC. And it took up 4 or 5 years of my life in a totally intensely pleasurable way. I spent most of my career at Berkeley and Johns Hopkins. Hopkins, at least, was just what it was. Berkeley, the level of bad faith is so intense. And so far
Well, that's where I'm in the UC system, and it's something between Chicago and UIC, and we allegedly have a faculty senate, and it's the capital of bad faith right now.
Yeah. So
And
the thing about it is that
but the sort of granular transformation, even of interpersonal relations, once you have the idea of solidarity with your colleagues, rather than this kind of like veiled level of competition and deep suspicion and atomization, that the level of like just simple interactions that would transform our relations at work would be monumental. But nobody wants that, because we have this faculty senate. And so I do think also, and this goes back to the PMC discussion we had earlier, that actually the moderate demands right now are the most radical. And that's sort of defunding the police. The most radical are the most neoliberal, and the most moderate.
Yes, I think there's some truth to that. And I'll give you an example. I'm not going to mention his name, but and also his politics are so totally not mine in various ways. We're good friends, but it's a joke between us. But our director of graduate studies. So if you really want to know who it is, you can look it up on the UIC website. Stepped down after 3 years. And he just gave his term was up. And he gave a little, talk just saying, fun doing that. And he said something about there have been a lot of high points. And he said exactly what we all knew right away. The high point, really, of his 3 years had been extremely successful, but very, very difficult, taxing for everybody, graduate student strike from 2 years ago. And why was it the high point? Because it did he didn't say all this, but I would say, because it did 2 things. One of the things it did was the kind of psychological thing you're talking about, which is that it actually made it clear, our faculty is unionized, our graduate students are unionized, almost everyone on our campus is unionized. That produces a certain very minor, very small, but very real sense that we actually all do belong to the same class. Some of us occupy much more privileged positions within that class than others, but nonetheless, we all turn out for the same things. We have a politics which is connected to it. So that was one reason why it was a high point. The other reason it was a high point was actually, it won something for the people involved. Their lives are different. They're not like way, way better. We are a large, underfunded, public university. Graduate students at UIC will never get the kind of support graduate students at U of C get, and the graduate students at U of C should get better support. All that's true, but nonetheless, they're better off now than they were before that strike. And that is something that makes a difference. And it's small and it's moderate, but the difference is intensified, universalized, it's transformative. Whereas, in effect, the end of racism is not in the same way transformative. It's totally desirable, right? But it's not in the same way transformative. You know, it did not make a slightest bit of difference that when all that was going on, our chancellor of our university was a Black woman. This is before the first union, or that the dean of our college was a Black man. That was simply changing the skin colors of the bosses. So there's a way in which, again, I think, you know, I don't want to make a thing out of class reduction except for, like, you know, an essay or something. But I think the advantage of thinking it through that lens is that it does reposition the question, which was, like, when I was 16 years old, the only question anybody about politics ever asked, which was it radical or was it reformist? And it's a question that seems to me now cannot help but be asked in bad faith, the way it gets asked now, because the things that are presented as radical are actually either unrelated to any particular kind of part, any action at all, or else actually just straight neoliberal. Whereas the things that are criticized as reformist are A, hard to do, B, useful for some people, and C, if taken to their logical extension, are indeed radically transformative. So can unions be the answer? They can't in the end be the answer, because if everybody was unionized, there could not be capital. So it's not as if having unions will solve the problem. And on the way, there are all the problems we know about unions. You know, all you have to do is have one to know that unions aren't perfect. But nonetheless, organizing a union is way more radical than, like, you know, making a pitch to hire more minority professors.
We have a question from Ella Heron, the pragmatic question that, Walter, I guess you'll have to answer.
I just did as good as I could do on pragmatics. So Ella, whatever the answer is join a union. So wait a minute. Can I ask you a question? Ella, are you there? What
Ella,
do you
are you
mean?
on mute?
What do you mean when you say so much of the working class is devoted to the identitarian politics that I was speaking of?
I just mean like coworkers at jobs that I've encountered. Many people have just in my life who are working class have this commitment to sort of an identity politics and to ending racism as their political goals. And I believe in I'm wondering what you think is the way to move people out of that.
Yeah. So again, you know, I mean, it really is true. It's not false modesty. It's like total confession of inadequacy. It's, you know, we are fucked up if English professors would be the ones who could tell us how to get out of this. I would just say, in effect, what I'm saying before. So I'll give you just one little maybe example of this. So, okay, we have a large, at UIC, because we're large underfunded public university, we have a very large contingent of non-tenure track faculty. So when we started to unionize, very suspicious of unionizing. Their politics, like the politics of any university faculty, are almost completely identitarian in most respects. Once the actual process of unionization got going, and once the actual bargaining for a contract got going, all these people, and indeed now our union is in part led, our last contract bargaining session was led by one of the NTT faculty from the English department, I'm proud to say. All of them actually got completely in touch with their interests as a class, as members of the working class. They didn't have to give up their anti-racism. There was no moment at which the union says, screw anti-racism. We're fine if we go back to racism, but we just want to get more money. On the contrary, I was our first lead negotiator, and I had to bow out after 6 months. And when you're doing that kind of thing, one of the things that they try to do is you try to get some early, easy agreements to sign off on. And all the bargainers on the administration side had read my book, The Trouble with Diversity, because it's kind of not that academic and readable. And they thought it was cool they were negotiating with someone who did this. So that they want us to be able to sign off on one article of our contract before I left. So what did we sign off on? The diversity article. Why? Because diversity you know, the interests of the faculty and the interests of the administration were completely identical on the diversity. We were all committed to diversity. And that was right. You don't have to give up. The trouble with diversity was not that diversity was bad. The trouble with diversity is that what it does in relation to class politics. So you don't have to give up the anti-racism. But the minute you're thinking, yeah, but I'm losing control of my classroom. I mean, I'm told that I have to teach this way. I'm told that I can no longer collaborate with somebody else. I'm doing it for almost no money. I'm doing it, and every year my contract's up for renewal. All those things. The minute those things come in place, you don't have to be politically sophisticated to begin to think, I care about those things. So part of the point really is that it's that organizing, not community organizing, right? And not organizing around, you know, identitarian organizing. It's organizing around actually the job you do. And what you hate, the first question you're always told to ask when you're trying to organize a labor force, right? What we were taught was 2 questions. What do you like about your job? What do you not like about your job? And the idea was the union was going to try, if we could make one, make the job more what you liked about it and make it less what you didn't like about it. And that brings out, in my limited experience. And so the politics of our faculty are exactly the same as they were. I mean, the first thing on their lips is anti-racism. But when we actually get to doing certain kind of political work, the first thing on their lips is the administration can't tell us to do that. We'll fucking go on strike if they tell us to do that. They can't. And that is completely helpful. For me, you know, I spent my formative years at Berkeley, which used to celebrate the fact that they decided not to unionize. And as far as I could tell at the time, the only issue they cared about was apartheid in South Africa. So y'all are barely born then, or not born at all. But it was big in its day. And you thought we were all against apartheid in South Africa. But what it meant to march around the Berkeley campus protesting apartheid in South Africa, when in fact, you could look at injustices in our workplace at every moment. And no one in the faculty was worried about that for a millisecond. You know, it's the moment when you have to organize in terms of your own work that you begin to think about what those categories are. So my version of that is that if it can happen to professors who have the, you know, just reek of bad faith, actually it can happen to anyone, even to whoever you're working with, wherever you're working. So that was like a long answer and totally useless, but nonetheless true.